When Susan and I talk about inquiry as a stance, we mean inquiry as a worldview, as a way of thinking about and knowing about practice, knowing about one's students. And we see it as a worldview that carries across the professional lifespan, not just something for student teachers or new teachers, but something that carries across and across educational settings. Again, it's not just for the beginning teacher in the classroom, it's also for teacher educators, for university-based teachers, and so on. This is based on the idea that educational practice isn't simply instrumental in the sense of figuring out how to get things done, but it's also, and just as importantly, it's social and political in the sense of deliberating about what to get done, why to get it done, who decides, and whose interests are served and whose interests might not be served. Here's a little more detail on how we conceptualize the idea of inquiry as stance. We see it in terms of three foundational ideas, and those are in the cream-colored box. I'm not going to read those, but under the arch. And then four critical dimensions. Three of them are in the pie pieces in the circle diagram below, and the fourth is the larger circle that surrounds the other three. The notion of inquiry stance is based on a view of knowledge that rejects the formal knowledge, practical knowledge dualism that often drives educational practice, especially things that are thought about as reform. And I think this is very true today, just as it was previously. But when this dualism is operating, formal knowledge is assumed to be theoretical, theories about teaching, and also knowledge about practice that is generalizable across teaching contexts, while practical knowledge is understood to be teachers' knowledge about what and how to do things in the classroom. So when this dualism, formal knowledge, practical knowledge, is in place, it's pretty easy to see that formal knowledge is understood to generally live in universities, to be generated by university researchers, and to be transported and implemented in classrooms, while practical knowledge is assumed to live in schools with teachers. Again, the notion of inquiry as stance rejects that dualism. Now, what I've just been saying about knowledge is a companion to and very consistent with the idea of practice. And Susan and I always talked about the notion of practice underlying inquiry as stance as being an expanded notion, a transformative view of practice. With this idea, practice isn't just practical. It's not just what teachers do or say. It's not just when or how teachers do things. And the walls of the classroom and of schools don't limit practitioners' commitments or define their responsibilities. So what we were trying to say with this idea is that from the perspective of inquiry as stance, practice isn't atheoretical. And theory and practice are not two distinct and dichotomous things, as in, and I think we continue to hear these phrases today, despite all the writing that we and many other people have done about what's wrong with this kind of distinction. We still hear, I think, researchers have knowledge, teachers have experience. Researchers theorize, teachers implement or put into practice. Researchers analyze, teachers do, or teachers act. So with inquiry as stance, practice is understood as inherently theoretical and interpretive and practical. And theory is understood to both inform and emerge from inquiry on practice. The third dimension of the way we conceptualized inquiry as stance, I've really already mentioned this, but that's the idea of community, and that inquiry communities are the primary mechanism for enhancing teachers' work. Now, this doesn't mean just let's get a whole bunch of teachers together and they can chat, and then whatever happens is good and it will improve their practice. Rather, this means communities that are organized to foster practitioner learning from inquiry over the professional lifespan and really link educators with larger change efforts. So learning from inquiry means communities of teachers working together to question their own assumptions. Again, we could see this in your presentation, Emer. It wasn't just about what are you doing? It's about what are you assuming? What are you thinking? Teachers together push each other about what assumptions they're making. And together, they pose problems of practice that require them to study their own students, study their own schools, study their own activities. What we argued and learned from our work with groups of new and experienced teachers was that communities foster relationships that alter the idea of expert novice as a model of proficiency, because everybody's a learner, everybody's a researcher. These kinds of communities also challenge the idea of the singular pursuit of best practice or core practice, and instead focus on consideration of practice finely tuned to local histories, local cultures, and local communities. And then finally, the fourth dimension of the idea of inquiry as stance has to do with purposes and ends of inquiry and teacher research. When teacher researchers work from an inquiry stance, as I was just saying, they problematize assumptions, but at many different levels, including the very purpose of existing educational systems. And working together and pushing each other, they often raise difficult questions about educational resources, how they're distributed, for whom, why, under what conditions, about what is often assumed to be a process that always happens this way because it's always happened this way, and outcomes. So here it's understood, and Susan and I found this to be true in all of the research we did about inquiry communities in places all over the world, that teachers engage in inquiry because they're committed to taking action to improve the day-to-day school lives and futures of the students and families they work with. We found that equity purposes, social justice purposes were at the source, were at the bottom and the beginning of what teachers were working on. And here I have always really liked Goswami and Stillman's description of teacher research. I think it's very appropriate here. They talked about teacher research as an agency for change. So in short, the bottom line of inquiry as stance are democratic purposes and social justice ends. Now, one of the reasons that I think the idea of inquiry as stance has had staying power is that it really contrasts dramatically with the idea of inquiry as a project, or inquiry as a problem-solving method, or a set of steps. If inquiry and teacher research are conceptualized as projects, the underlying message is that inquiry is something that's turned on and off at given points in time, with the lines separating teaching and researching very clear. Likewise, when inquiry is seen as a method or a specific set of steps for solving problems, it positions the teacher as a receiver of information without much room for questioning the ways problems are posed in the first place, or for problematizing the terms and logics of larger frames. When teacher research and inquiry are projects, we sometimes hear, and maybe none of you have heard this, but I certainly have. So when teacher research is a project, we sometimes hear student teachers say, I don't have time to do teacher research because I'm too busy when I'm in the classroom learning to teach. And teacher research is just one more add-on that I can't deal with. But if inquiry and research are understood as a stance, it's integral to the activity of teaching, and inquiring and engaging in research is understood as an indivisible part of learning to teach. Now, here's the third idea with staying power, is that there are dramatically different assumptions about the relationships of knowledge and practice that underlie and drive all sorts of programs, projects, initiatives, research studies, policies related to teacher learning, very, very, very broadly construed, and that these differences really matter. They are powerful. They have everything to do with how projects are set up, what kinds of outcomes are expected and hoped for, and have everything to do with the different kinds of experiences people have. So a word about the context. In the 1990s, when we were first working on this idea, there were so many initiatives related to teacher learning, whether it was initial teacher education or induction or ongoing professional development for teachers or mentoring projects and programs. There were so many initiatives, but we found that even initiatives that sometimes used the same language to describe what they were doing were really quite different when you looked beneath the surface. So we found that it was really necessary to try to unpack what was beneath the surface. So we started looking at first assumptions about teaching knowledge. And that means what was assumed about what knowledge teachers need in order to teach better. And where does that knowledge come from? What are its sources? What are its forms? Who generates it? Who evaluates it? Who interprets it? A whole set of assumptions about teaching knowledge. We also looked at assumptions about practice and teachers. And this had to do with questions like, what is assumed to be the nature of the activity of teaching? What's included when people talk about practice? What's included in that concept? What are they thinking of? What are they talking about? What are the roles of teachers? What's assumed about that to be the role of teachers in and outside of classrooms? And this whole question about whether teachers can or should be agents for change. And can teachers be generators of knowledge? Lots and lots of disagreement about that. And then finally, we tried to uncover and look at varying assumptions about professional learning. And this basically had to do with the assumptions that are made about the kinds of context, whether they're intellectual, social, or organizational contexts, that support teachers' professional learning initially and over time. And what are the roles of other groups in that learning? What are the roles of school communities? What are the roles of school-university partnerships and universities and programs? We identified three major knowledge practice relationships by looking at a whole lot of programs, initiatives, projects related to teacher learning that were being developed at the same time. So these projects all coexisted. And as I said before, used a lot of the same language, but as it turns out, we're very different. We called these three relationships knowledge for practice, knowledge in practice, and knowledge of practice. We found that when the knowledge for practice set of assumptions was operating, it was assumed that what teachers needed to know to teach well was formal knowledge, and that could include subject matter, theory, as well as proven practices. This formal knowledge base is university generated, university codified. It was assumed that practice then was applying the formal knowledge base. And people who were the best teachers were the people who did the best job of applying that knowledge base. Teachers were clearly here understood as receivers of knowledge, consumers of knowledge. And it was assumed that the context for increasing, for the context for professional learning were those contexts that increased teachers' access to the knowledge base and gave them opportunities to rehearse good practice, which was implementing the knowledge base. When the knowledge in practice relationship was operating, a different set of assumptions. What do you need to know to teach well? You need practical knowledge, sometimes called the craft of teaching. This is generated by school-based educators. Practice then was assumed to be practical, what good teachers do, and teachers were the holders of the wisdom of experience. In terms of professional learning, the idea was to create context for imitating, trying out, and reflecting on what good teachers do. And we see this today in programs that are set up so that new teachers have more and more and more time in classrooms to watch supposedly good teachers do what they do and to try to imitate that. Finally, when the knowledge of practice set of assumptions was operating, the idea was not so much and not at all the formal knowledge, practical knowledge distinction that I mentioned earlier. That idea was rejected. Rather, the focus was on local knowledge, which can be useful publicly too. It's not just local. And that this knowledge is generated and critiqued by both university and school-based educators. Here, practice was seen as simultaneously practical and theoretical, and teachers were seen as both critical consumers and generators of knowledge, and as actors and agents for change. With the knowledge-practice relationship improving professional learning for teachers and student teachers and others means creating context for communities to inquire together, posing questions, talking about problems of practice, and studying the data of practice to rethink both what they're doing and what they're assuming in the ways they interpret what they're doing. In terms of staying power, it seems that a framework like this that helps sort out the assumptions about knowledge, practice, and learning does have staying power and can be helpful. And just a side note, our initial framework, which we worked on in the 1990s, the late 1990s, was just included in the 2025 Handbook of Teacher Work. The editors wanted this framework in the handbook, and they asked us to write a commentary in the present day. So that to me is sort of a piece of evidence that this kind of a framework that prompts us to look below the surface, to try to get at the assumptions, is indeed valuable. I also had a chance to use this framework just last year in a keynote I gave at the Norwegian University of Science and Technology, where they're under a lot of pressure from policymakers to make teacher education more practical. And they wanted me to help them figure out what does that mean and what could it mean. And we looked at examples of projects that try to make teacher education more practice-based, which means a whole lot of different things. We looked at examples internationally, and we used this framework to sort out how they were different from one another. And that seemed to be helpful. So I do think an idea like this has staying power. So I know that was a whirlwind. thing, but I also am counting on the fact that you in the audience have a lot of familiarity with these kinds of ideas. And so I hope that you've been able to connect these to things you're thinking about. I understand that we're going to have breakout groups now, and I think Maureen is going to do that organizing, but she asked me to suggest some questions for discussion. So here are three, but you are certainly welcome to talk about other issues that are important to you and connect to the work I've just been talking about. Just very quickly, in your own context, and I know people here are in different contexts. Some are in primary and secondary classrooms, some are teacher educators, some are university researchers, some are working in various kinds of professional learning projects. So in your context, do these ideas have power? Do they have staying power? And the other two questions are related. What factors and conditions support or stand in the way of instantiating these kinds of ideas in practice? And finally, how can or are practitioners, researchers, and policies creating supportive conditions? And here, I thought people might well have examples of initiatives and projects where there are the conditions that support this kind of work and might want to share with each other. So I'm going to stop there. I'm 1.5 minutes over on my time. I'm sorry. Thank you.
Oh, thank you so much. That was just astounding. Thank you so much. Fabulous.